All right, welcome back, everyone. We have our final video of this unit of the digestive system, so we're just going to finish up. We don't have too much left. We just have a couple slides relating to some more conditions associated to digestive system, some pathophys, and then I'm just going to do like a general review of the entire gastrointestinal tract, just to kind of make sure we're good with that, and then that's pretty much it. All right, so here's where we left off. We were talking about emesis, also known as vomiting. We mentioned quite a bit about that as far as what can cause it. Next, we're going to talk about diverticulosis. Diverticulosis is a situation that affects the large intestine, especially as we reach the descending and transverse, the descending and sigmoid, as you can see in this picture here. In this case, they're going to have a situation where you lack enough fiber. Fiber, as we mentioned, is back in macromolecules. Fiber, as we mentioned, is a complex carb. It does amazing work for feeding the bacteria that live in your large intestine, or your natural flora, as we call it. So you really want to make sure you consume enough fiber on a day-to-day basis. If you have a balanced diet, this shouldn't be a problem. You should definitely be consuming enough fiber, and you wouldn't have any notices with that. So what we observe with this condition is that we start to see these little pouches form that you can see here, and you can also see in the scan here. Diverticula. The diverticula are the pouches that form on the colon wall. The actual condition, diverticulosis, is when you're going to have, or diverticulitis, as we say, or inflammation, is when those pouches become inflamed. And when they become inflamed, fecal matter, when it's supposed to be just moving through the colon and down to the descending into the sigmoid, some of it gets trapped. If fecal matter gets trapped in the body and doesn't fully exit, that becomes breeding ground for bacteria. Now you might be thinking, wait a second, I thought you already mentioned that we have bacteria in the large intestine. That is totally true. But this can be breeding grounds for dangerous bacteria and bacteria that can harm us. Not to mention, if those diverticula stay where they're at for long enough, they burst. That's obviously something really harmful to the body. Not only could the pain of that bursting really personally affect you, but it's also a matter of fecal matter inside of there spreading to other organs. The bacteria in there definitely spreading to other organs. This can be very serious if left untreated. But like I mentioned, the good news is most people don't deal with this if you're consuming adequate amounts of fiber. Hepatitis. Okay, so hepatitis is a rather complex condition, and there's different types of hepatitis. Hepatitis is, traditionally speaking, if you're just going to define the word, inflammation of the liver. Remember, itis as a suffix means inflammation. Hepa as a prefix means liver. So like hepatic, for instance. So what we observe with this is a viral infection. Where this can come from, it can come from contaminated water. So in some areas, especially some impoverished countries, where their filtration system isn't the best and people may be drinking from rivers. The problem with that is you don't know where the water is coming from or who could be upstream, possibly releasing themselves. And then obviously, if you're drinking the water downstream, it's now contaminated. Blood transfusions. This was a big, big, big issue in the 60s and 70s, especially. Take, for instance, tattoo parlors. Tattoo parlors had to get more restrictions and more guidelines for safety because there were some parlors, and definitely not all of them by the slightest, but there were some parlors that were getting away with using the same tattoo guns on multiple customers. The problem with that, obviously, is that the tattoo gun is interacting with your blood. So if you had someone who was hepatitis positive and got a tattoo, for instance, and that parlor continued to use that gun on 3 or 4 other people that day, you just successfully transferred that viral infection. That was a big deal. Nowadays, any sort of legitimate tattoo parlor has to have restrictions on this. Literally, anytime you go into one of these places, and even if you're just watching someone getting tattooed, they have to exchange the needles every single time after they've worked with different people, and it's much more clean and hygiene focused. And last but not least, hepatitis is something, a different type of hepatitis, should we say, is something that could be transmitted sexually speaking. This is, of course, why we want to use our contraceptives and make sure that you're protecting yourself. But that is something to be careful with. So what are some of the things that we have noticed? First of all, on the right-hand side, this is a liver that has been severely, severely damaged. by the point where you're here, the liver's done. It would have to be totally removed. If someone has a liver removal, um, truthfully, you would need a liver replacement. As I mentioned a couple videos ago, the liver is super regenerative. It can do a really good job with just a small portion of it, roughly 1/3 of it being healthy. You give it enough time, it will regrow, but not every time. Not every time is it able to regenerate, especially due to viral infections, which can be so powerful and potent. One of the more easy identifiers as far as symptoms of hepatitis is jaundice. Jaundice, as some of you may know, is discoloration of the skin, or more clearly, what most people notice, the eyes. Remember how the whites of our eyes are the sclera? Well, in a patient suffering from possibly hepatitis or other conditions, jaundice, you're going to see the whites of the eyes turn more of a yellowish color. You normally see this often with people that are unfortunately abusing alcohol. If someone who's been abusing a lot of alcohol, their liver has taken quite a bit of damage, you're going to notice the eyes, the whites of the eyes turn more of a yellowish hue. Cirrhosis. This is another condition that affects the liver. Chronic inflammation of the liver. So this is unlike hepatitis, where that's a viral infection. This is just inflammation due to a number of problems. Again, alcoholism, you see here, could be directly linked to this. So this is inflammation, and it's chronic, meaning not only does your liver inflame, but it stays inflamed for prolonged periods of time. Here we see what a healthy liver should look like. Here we see on the bottom two areas what a diseased liver can look like. Again, with cirrhosis, similar to hepatitis, if left untreated, if you don't change your lifestyle, especially if it's more of like an alcoholism purpose, the only solution will be liver removal. And then if we need our liver to survive, it is one of the essential organs. So if that happens, you're on a list, basically a waiting list of hoping that your liver can survive long enough to keep you going, and at the same time getting a replacement liver to help you out. Last but not least, I always love talking about this. I wish I could have the normal classroom setting for this, because this is always something that I get a lot of people freaking out about. It's kind of similar to what we talked about in other units, like with earwigs and skin worms. But this stuff always fascinates me, just because, like, our planet is filled with stuff that is just creepy and strange. So intestinal worms. Intestinal worms are parasites. If you know the whole relationship between animals on this planet, we know that there's things that have like a symbiotic relationship, right? Where it's like the you scratch my back, I scratch your back situation. So, classic example of a symbiotic relationship could be like giraffes. There's a species of bird that perches on giraffes and just eats the little bacteria that's on the little bugs that are on giraffes. So the symbiotic relationship there is that it eats the bugs that could be harming the giraffe, and the giraffe makes it like a home, basically, for those little birds. You see this all over the place. Alligators have a symbiotic relationship with another bird species that it helps to clean the teeth. Sharks have a symbiotic relationship with these little tiny, like worm-like structures that basically clean the skin of the shark, but it feeds the shark simultaneously, or it feeds the worm-like species. A lot of cool relationships like that exist naturally. Now, that's a symbiotic relationship. A parasitic relationship, very different. A parasitic relationship is where one person or one host only gets the benefit, and the other host is just getting harmed the entire time. Worms, for the most part, especially these type of intestinal worms, are just strictly parasites. So what happens here is that they eat the bowel contents. So they actually feed off of fecal matter and suck blood from the intestinal walls. Most worms are obtained by consuming raw foods or interacting with pets that are infected. This is very important to be aware of. Now, the raw food part, I think we can be aware of that, right? Like, I actually really enjoy sushi. I think it's a good food. I know it's a bit of an acquired taste for some people, but almost every sushi parlor you go to is going to be doing things the right way. However, if you go to like a gas station and you're like, I'm hungry, I don't know what to eat, I'm just going to grab random sushi that might be 4 months old, yeesh, that's where you're running into problems, right? So, raw food, you really want to make sure you cook your food thoroughly, or if it is something you're still consuming that's raw, You want to make sure that it's trusted, that it was prepped the right way and cooked the right way, because there is still a cooking process for this raw stuff anyway. Um, the pets aspect of it, really want to make sure. Anytime you adopt a pet or if you purchase a pet, the biggest thing that they check is, do they have the proper vaccinations? Do they have the proper medication for like heartworm, for instance, which literally is, as it sounds, a worm that affects the hearts of a lot of these animals? Or have they been given the proper treatment? Because the problem with this, especially these worms, yes, this is a massive example of this, right? Up to 20 meters long, which is huge. But in most cases, especially with pets, you don't notice it. You don't see it. And it can be very easy, unfortunately, to be petting your animal and suddenly, I don't know, from your hand, you touch your face and then boom, that's how these things transfer. So here's how this whole process works. It's a very methodical process with how these worms grow. They have a special coating that allows them to pass their way through the digestive system undetected, basically, not getting destroyed by the stomach acid. They reach the small intestine. By the time they reach the small intestine, they're very microscopic. You would not see this stuff. Well, these worms kind of figure out, like, hey, this is the perfect home. I've got security in here. I don't have to worry about other animals or other predators possibly attacking me. I have food because every time you eat, you're feeding the worm. And I have space to grow. So, and possibly lay eggs, right? So these worms are going to continue growing and growing and growing. The only way that someone figures out they have an intestinal worm, it is not like Aliens. If you ever seen that classic movie, Ridley Scott, where the alien grows and then eventually the chest burster, as they call it, bursts out of the chest. It's nothing crazy like that. The only way someone would know this is some time starts to pass, like a week or so, and you notice you're losing weight. For some people, they're probably like, oh, okay, what's the problem? But eventually you start losing a lot of weight and your energy levels start to decrease and you start noticing, I don't know what's going on. I eat regularly, but I'm losing a lot of weight. Something's wrong. You go to the doctor, and if you explain all your symptoms and everything like that, the doctor probably is going to ask you, we need a fecal sample. So they're going to give you this bag. Literally, you have to put fecal matter into the bag, and then they're going to test it. Upon testing it, you will literally see eggs of the intestinal worm in the fecal matter. And that's when the doctor has to tell you the bad news and say, unfortunately, you've got a little friend, if you want to call it that, living in your small intestine, and it's eating you to death. Literally, if nothing were to be done, if you had an intestinal worm, no treatment, no medication, it will just keep growing and eating and eating and eating until you starve, until you have no nutrition possible. That's what a parasite does. It will just feast and feast and feast as long as it can. Now, the good news is, especially in like our country and a lot of our modern medicinal countries, you find out you have a worm, a doctor's going to give you a prescription or a medication that basically accelerates the process of your digestive system. You're going to go to the bathroom a lot, like a laxative. Well, here's the disturbing part. When you get rid of these worms, just like the kidney stone thing I was talking about in the last video, you just have to pass these worms. You literally defecate them. And obviously, if it grows to a length of this size, they're like the size of they're visible. They look like tape. Um, so the long story short is cook your food adequately if you're someone that likes to cook in the kitchen, and if you're going to eat raw foods, make sure it's from a place that's reputable and that they know what they're doing. That's really the big idea here. All right, so I'm going to try to show you guys a little bit of a review here. So let me go ahead and see what I can do on my side. All right, so the only thing here that I'm going to do is just do my best to draw the different regions of, let me move this inside a little bit, draw the different regions of the digestive system. just kind of understanding what the tract looks like, right? Okay, so let's see how this looks. If we're going to start off in the top, you're of course going to have something like a face, but that obviously looks terrible. So let's just try that again. Give it one more try. Sure, we'll make it look like Pac-Man. All right, so everything, the food is going to enter directly into the oral cavity, which will label some stuff a little bit later. As it enters the oral cavity, it needs to pass its way down into the esophagus. The esophagus is simply just the tube that goes all the way into the stomach. Stomach, something like that, right? That's perfectly fine. I'm actually going to make this a little bit smaller. There you go. So once it enters the stomach, you're going to enter this convoluted tube-like structure. So let's connect a little bit of that. This tube-like structure, This tube-like structure is really complex maze called the small intestine. The small intestine, of course, is just going to allow for digestion and further absorption of food, right? That's the entire point. And then finally, to try to wrap this all together as close as I can, we're going to have the large intestine. So the large intestine wraps all together. And voila, as close as voila as we can, I guess. It's very obvious that my drawing skills are not the greatest, but we can start to label some stuff. We have up here the oral cavity. We have right here the esophagus. We have right here the stomach. This maze-like structure, we're going to call that the small intestine. I'm just going to shorthand that to SI. And then what I like to call the scarf of the small intestine, we're just going to call that the LI. Large intestine. Yeah, there's some stuff missing that you can definitely add. I just don't want to make this too complicated, but like for instance, we have the the liver is not in a box. It's more like that. The liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas. There's a lot more you can add. The whole point of all this I'm drawing here is I would suggest on your point or on your time drawing something similar just in your notes just to get a little bit of practice in. I think if you can have the ability to properly draw it, that gives you a good representation of what there is and what structures there are. Obviously, you can always just do it through Quizlet. That's a little bit more of an accurate representation too, but it's up to you. So that was our last video, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Again, I would highly recommend you go through every video just to make sure you're comfortable with the material. We will have a Kahoot like I did last time. It'll be via Google Hangouts, a good way to practice if you want to. The test, biggest difference, I'll share more of the physical response to this next week. The biggest difference is I'll be opening the test for a full day. That way, some of you that are waking up a little bit later in the day, or maybe have things to do in the morning, have some more time to take it in the afternoon or evening. And then the short essay, the biggest change for that is if you prefer to record yourself answering the short essay, submit it as a video to me via Classroom. I am perfectly fine with that, so no problems there. All right, thanks, guys. Have a good one.